Autumn 1942. A raiding party glides through dark, freezing waters. Special Forces, a British military elite. Trained to expect anything. Lethal fire screams out from the shoreline. The bullets are real. The raid isn't. Attackers and defenders are both British. This operation, under live fire, is the conclusion to a terrifying ordeal in the wilds of Scotland. A new kind of training for a new kind of soldier. The Commando. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had called for their creation, a band of highly trained elite soldiers designed to hit back at Nazi-occupied Europe. This wilderness would become their training ground. A Highland estate, Achnacarry, a place rooted in the bloody history of the Scottish Highlands, transformed into a paramilitary academy, a finishing school for elite forces. With its ferocious and occasionally fatal training regime, Achnacarry built a new generation of fighting men. It also built a legend.
Die deutschen Operationen nehmen ihren Lauf.
The news from France is very bad, and I grieve for the gallant French people.
Während an der Aisne eine Abwehrflanke errichtet wird, stoßen deutsche Panzer und hinter ihnen in unabsehbarer Folge Infanteriedivisionen.
Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for all of 16 days. In that short time, Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, had overrun the Low Countries and northern France. Over 200,000 British troops retreated towards the Channel ports. From the beaches of Dunkirk, most escaped back to England, a brave yet undignified rescue. This was the end of May 1940. The situation was desperate, but the Prime Minister's rhetoric was uncompromising.
We have become the sole champions now in arms to defend the world cause. We shall fight on, unconquerable, until the curse of Hitler is lifted from the brows of men.
On the 3rd of June 1940, the Prime Minister wrote to his chiefs of staff.
It is of the highest consequence to keep the largest numbers of German forces all along the coasts of the countries that have been conquered, and we should immediately set to work on organizing raiding forces on these coasts.
It's a simple military equation. You've got no heavy forces, you've got command of the sea, but you can't take soldiers and all the equipment needed back across to the continental mainland. So what do? You try to work out how you can get small parties of soldiers into key positions on the European mainland, especially on the coast, where they can do great damage to the German war effort. Now, there are two things there. One is that it makes the Germans realize that Britain hasn't thrown in the towel. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it shows the British people who are being bombed day in and day out that it's still possible to take the war to the Germans. Terrific for morale.
Britain already had elite amphibious raiding troops, the Royal Marines, under the command of the Royal Navy. Churchill's new force would be established by their deadly rivals, the British Army.
You see, his sort of job calls for selected and highly trained men who can work and fight in small parties or even alone. What are they then?
Specialists, my son. Specialists. Highly trained amphibious soldiers.
See?
This 1945 propaganda film tells the story of their early years.
Thanks, pal. What I call service. It did teach you to read.
And how these new soldiers recruited a new word into the English dictionary.
Commando, a term used during the Boer War. A body of armed burghers.
Blimey, nobody can call me that and get away with it.
It's an insult.
Forget it, Mac. The bloke who wrote this dictionary can't even spell.
Pay attention, man.
Commandos were all volunteers from every regiment of the British Army. Jimmy Dunning worked in the family butchers in Southampton. He played drums in a dance band. In June 1939, he decided to join up.
I saw in the musical magazine Melody Maker that the 11th Hussars in Egypt wanted a drummer with experience in dance band. I thought, well, that's a job for me. I was then 19 years of age.
Jimmy signed up, but the war interrupted his plans. The posting to Egypt was cancelled. After a year at a desk job, the young sergeant was looking for something new.
The orders appeared calling for volunteers for special service. It didn't say what it was, but the list of things that were details it gave: able to swim, not prone to seasickness, willing to parachute.
Also, it is your opportunity to become a first-class British fighting soldier, because that's exactly what a commando is. Now, if you're in earnest, we want you, and we want you badly.
It was no test at all. It was just an interview, and it seemed to be if your face fitted and you had the right sort of attitude to this, you were in.
Louder.
They were given an allowance of 6 shillings and 8pence, which in today's currency is 33p, and a ration card, and had to find their own billets.
British seaside towns had no shortage of bed and breakfast billets for this new fighting force. Jimmy Dunning joined No. 4 Commando, based initially in Weymouth and later on the Clyde coast. Those first months were beset with difficulties. All too often, Churchill's special forces seemed far from special.
We didn't have any suitable landing craft. So at Weymouth, for instance, we had to carry out sort of amphibious exercises from either requisitioned fishing boats or borrowed rowing boats. It's a bit shambolic from that point of view. And also we suffered from a lack of weapons.
The newborn British Army commandos had no shortage of critics. Evelyn Waugh, the celebrated English novelist and satirist, transferred from the Royal Marines to become intelligence officer for 8 Commando. He was less than impressed.
Took the morning train to Largs, a smug, substantial modern pleasure resort, or rather pleasure as the Scots perceive it. 2 night operations in which I acted as umpire showed great incapacity in the simplest tactical details. The indolence and ignorance of the officers seemed remarkable. One troop leader was unable to read a compass. Setting out, drunk, for one of the operations, I fell down and cut my lip, but nobody thought the worse of me.
Waugh was a ferocious drinker, a ferocious snob. His accounts of the early commandos should be seasoned with more than a pinch of salt. But his description of these supposedly elite soldiers wasn't entirely fictional.
They had to learn as they went along. It was the only possible way. And so inevitably mistakes were made. Inevitably egos were punctured.
And no ego was more punctured than that of Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, the man in overall charge of the commandos. His letters to his superiors at the War Office reveal a desperate struggle for support.
The Navy has failed to provide the ships and landing craft to prosecute amphibious warfare. The Air Ministry puts every obstacle in the way of carrying them overseas by air.
Time and again, the Prime Minister was called on to intervene personally, to demand more and better resources for his commandos. But to survive, the commandos needed more than the support of their Prime Minister. They needed better organization, and above all, better training. A solution came from the north. In May 1940, a young Scottish nobleman set out on a journey to the north and west, to Fort William and beyond, to the untamed Loch Harbour Hills. That young man was Lord Shimmy Lovat, chief of the Fraser clan, an outdoorsman, a soldier and hunter. Lovat, his cousin David Stirling, and their gang of upper-class military mavericks had a plan to toughen up Britain's elite soldiers. They wanted to build a top-secret Highland academy, teaching the dark arts of guerrilla warfare. At the head of Loch Islet, Lovat found the ideal location, Inverailet House. Their first mission was to evict the owner, the 80-year-old Mrs. Cameron Head, something they achieved with ruthless haste.
When I arrived at Loch Islet Station, there were only 2 officers who said the castle was half emptied and they had no accommodation for me.
Her family home was about to become the British military's school of irregular warfare, staffed by a unique team of specialist instructors, mountaineers, Arctic explorers, Olympic marksmen.
They had this sense of the tradition of the Highlands and of the sporting culture, the field sports in the Highlands, of this being a testing ground, a place where men's individual character and worth and endurance could be put to the test. People could use the sea lochs, the mountains for the training. There's a railway line here that they use for demolition, so you've got practical reasons. So all that combines with this older idea about this being a place where hard men are bred.
Lovat himself remembered just how hard the training could be.
Gales of wind and rain swept the glens all through October and November. We worked hard to keep warm. The elements combined to provide new and dangerous conditions for day and night training exercises. 30% of students failed to last the course.
As the commandos really get going, small groups of commando officers and NCOs and selected men are coming from their commando units. I mean, their units are training all the time, but they come here to get a particularly intensive training scheme, which they are intended to take back to their units and pass on.
The Loch Islet curriculum included sabotage, climbing, navigation and weapons training. Men arrived from every area of the military to take the course. And none more famous than a 30-year-old veteran of the Highland Light Infantry who arrived in July 1940. David Niven was already a major movie star. He deserted his contract with Sam Goldwyn and re-enlisted in the British Army.
I was to report to a prohibited area in Scotland, Loch Islet Castle. After 2 months running up and down the mountains of the Western Highlands, crawling up streams at night and swimming in the loch with full equipment, I was unbearably fit.
But the real stars of Loch Islet were not from the movie business. They were 2 mature gentlemen, Mr. Fairbairn and Mr. Sykes. masters of dirty fighting.
They were former Shanghai policemen in the 30s, Shanghai being a place of particular problems with gangs and violent crime. And this pair had developed ways of dealing with that for the Shanghai police, particularly in unarmed combat and in knife fighting and in close quarter shooting.
Fairbairn's uncompromising and somewhat excruciating techniques survive in this American military training film. And they also survive in print. In 1942, Fairbairn published a guidebook to his ruthless new philosophy.
This is All in Fighting, which is a training manual, and it runs the range from the kind of straightforward knee in the groin type actions to how to break someone's back.
As soon as you come up on him on that target, you're going to want him down on the ground, telling him what to do, in terms to get down, giving him directions, exactly what you want him to do from then.
Hey, down on the ground, hands out to the side.
Inver Islet developed methods and philosophies of fighting still relevant to today's commandos.
Loads of aggression, get him on the floor, put his face in the dirt, get that weapon off him, let him know you're in charge.
Get on the floor, get on the floor.
Disarm pistols from behind. It's exactly the same technique you've just seen demonstrated by my guys here. And the fact is that this manual that was first brought in by W.E. Fairbairn has stood the test of time. A lot of these techniques have been used 50, 60 years later, not just by the British forces, not just by British commanders, but around the world.
Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when we've definitely got them on the run. Let us treat them very kindly, as we would a valued friend. We might send them out some bishops as a form of lease and lend. Let's be sweet to them.
Some of the methods of unarmed combat outlined by Fairbairn were deeply controversial. Strangulation, the deadly bronco kick, and even eye gouging.
Let's be beastly to the Hun.
Fairbairn talks about moral scruples in doing this kind of thing. Some readers may be appalled at the suggestion that it should be necessary for human beings of the 20th century to revert to the grim brutality of the Stone Age in order to live. But it must be realised that when dealing with an utterly ruthless enemy who has clearly expressed his intention of wiping this nation out of existence, there is no room for any scruple or compunction about the methods to be employed in preventing him.
London pride has been handed down to us. London pride is a flower that's free.
Late in 1940, Fairbairn and Sykes travelled from Loch Islet to London for a meeting with designers from the Wilkinson Sword Company. The result was a commando legend, the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife.
What strikes me about this is it's just got one purpose, and that is to kill. Whereas some modern day commander will have a variety of knives and for a variety of purposes. This just had one task, and it just really proves how in your face and how personal the commandos got with their enemy. Pull, down. Nice. This shows how long it would take to lose consciousness or death. And the interesting thing for me is this chart is still being used today, and the timings are exactly the same, and this book's also from the 1940s.
Britain's commandos had come to life in 1940, a year marked by frustration, disappointment, and battles with the War Office. In 1941, now better organised and better trained, the commandos began to build a reputation. Raids on German-occupied Norway at Lofoten and later Vagsø were spectacular successes.
So the combined operation continued its successful course, with fires gutting the German positions, their ammunition dumps, and the industries forced to work for them.
Men drawn largely from 3 commando, some trained at Inver Islet, overpowered the German garrison and obliterated Nazi-controlled industry.
fish oil factory, that was.
Then they disappeared back to sea. They'd been ashore for less than 8 hours. It was called the perfect raid. Vargso forced Hitler to deploy extra men to defend Norway and forced the British War Office to recruit and train even more commandos.
This very specialised course that is run at Inverarler isn't quite doing what's needed anymore. The commandos become something that's going to be much bigger and something that's going to work more closely with conventional military forces. And the feeling was that some sort of dedicated Commando Training Centre was needed.
The answer wasn't far away. 30 miles east was Achnacarry, a strip of land between Loch Lochy and Loch Arkaig, home to the Cameron clan. This ivy-clad chimney is all that remains of the first Achnacarry castle, burned to the ground by the British Army in 1746. Punishment for the Cameron's support of the Jacobite Rising. 200 years later, the British Army were back, this time as a force of occupation.
My grandfather was a military man. He'd raised 3 battalions of Cameron Highlanders in the First World War, one of which got wiped out at Luce with very few survivors. And I don't think he ever really recovered from that, but he was a proud man, and I think he thought that Achnacarry, if it could help the war effort, would be fine to be requisitioned, and was indeed quite proud of the fact.
What was being planned in these Lochaber Hills had never been done before. Achnacarry was to mass-produce elite fighting men on an industrial scale. Recent raids into occupied Europe had proved the commando's worth. Britain was desperate to produce more. Thousands and thousands more. If Achnacarry was to be a success, it would need the best talent available. Men like Sergeant Major Jimmy Dunning. At the age of 23, the butcher's son from Southampton headed north to become an instructor at Achnacarry. Like thousands after him, it all began at Speen Bridge railway station. This unassuming Highland village welcomed commando recruits from the army, then later the Royal Marines, and even the police force.
Blame me if we didn't start training as soon as we got there. No getting out onto the platform, that's too civilised. They made us get out on the wrong side and scramble across the lines.
Inverarler had taught men by the dozen. Achnacarry's all-new commando course was preparing to train hundreds and thousands of men.
Trainees arriving at Speen Bridge, most of these lads in their early 20s, and they hadn't been more than 100 miles from their homes, and coming up to Scotland to see these hills and mountains was quite an eye-opener for them. No idea of what it was like. As you imagine, when they're marching down here in the introduction, God, have we got to climb these hills in full kit? And it was quite a, well, it was a shock.
But the scenery hit us right in the eye, all the way to the camp. Hills, rivers, mountains. Bonnie Scotland. It's a hell of a place, Steppy.
Turn right up here. It all comes back to me after nearly 70 years. I suppose it was firmly implanted on my mind then.
What a pleasure.
What an honour.
I'm sure this place brings back many happy memories.
Yeah, 70 years nearly.
Since you've been here?
Yes.
Oh, golly.
It's a long time,
Long
isn't it?
time. And do you remember a lot about it?
Yes, I was here for about 20 months.
Right.
We We lived rough here, you know, we had canvas beds, no water, we had buckets, canvas buckets.
70 years ago, this first floor bedroom was home to Jimmy Dunning and 4 fellow instructors.
That's a photograph taken from this room, and you see our view with the Nissen huts down here and the Barrack Square just out there.
Most recruits would never see the inside of the castle. Norman Rose arrived as a 17-year-old Royal Marine. His experience of Achnacarry was radically different to Jimmy Dunning's.
None of this greenery behind the wire fence was there, and in its stead there was a row of Nissen huts that went the whole length right as far as the far end of the field. This side of the Nissen huts there were tents, and I lived in a tent. I never got into a Nissen hut except in the one that was the dining hall. You only remember the good bits, you know. We had some good fun. As I say, we were all 17-year-olds, but it was pretty grim. I was always a bit cold and always wet and always terribly hungry.
For the privileged few living inside the castle, officers and instructors, this was the mess room.
That's this room.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, but you see, there weren't windows there and there. We knocked those 2 windows through.
Right.
And I think people said that the wood was stained more here than anywhere else because of all the drinkings.
A young instructor called Brian Mullen transformed the room into a temporary art gallery.
And he died on D-Day, did he?
He died on D-Day, one of the first casualties going up the beach. And he was in the engineers, and he had quite a creative mind.
Right.
Yes.
You've got an amazing memory for all these people.
Well,
They're etched into your brain, aren't they?
I know, but I can't remember what happened last Tuesday.
But I think he was a very good artist, actually. I think they were all quite fun. But my mother felt she couldn't live with them, so we...
Yeah,
we, you know,
I think she's right, really.
Jimmy Dunning was the camp's youngest instructor. In overall charge was the Laird of Achnacarry, Camp Commandant Charlie Vaughan.
He was an ex-guardsman. He'd been at Coldstream Guards, NCO, he'd become a commissioned officer, very experienced soldier. He'd been an administrative officer with the commandos for some time. And he brought a mix of the commando idea, which he fully, endorsed and understood. But he also had this kind of regular army guards discipline approach.
Charlie had a wonderful understanding of human nature. He knew just when to give a chap a real, what we call a bollocking, and when to praise him. And he didn't mince his words, and he had a lovely delivery.
The best surviving examples of Vaughan's vernacular are in the pages of Castle Commando, written by Vaughan's great friend, Camp Adjutant Donald Gilchrist. Setting out on an exercise, a young officer asks Vaughan if transport will be laid on to bring his men back to base.
Transport? Transport? Good God, here I am. I've done my best to help you. I lay on a very pleasant day on Ben Nevis. You'll like that hill. It belongs to Lochiel, and he's very proud of it. All you can think of is transport.
Charlie Vaughan's training school was radically different to anything that had gone before. This one remarkable photograph shows the sheer scale of the operation.
This is a photograph from Achnacarry here in front of us from June 1944, when probably this is the operation at its height. Achnacarry is a kind of production line of commandos in training. You've got the staff at the front here, and there's the pipe band. Achnacarry had its own pipe band, which was a a kind of nod towards the Highland heritage of the place, and they would greet the trainees when they arrived from the train at Spean Bridge.
From the moment we arrived here, we were run round the hills, assault courses, forced marches, never a minute to ourselves, and even a bit of perverse sadism in it, because when you thought the day was over and everything would finish, a whistle would blow and they say right up the mountain here and right into the dark at night. It was 4 or 5 weeks of absolute hell.
As a trainee at Achnacarry, you're put through a daily diet of different lessons, if you like. It's almost like a kind of intensified schooling, so that you would have different disciplines going on at different times of the day. So you might, in the morning, be on the rope assault course. In the afternoon, you might be doing hand-to-hand fighting. The difference from Inverisle is that there's more unit fighting going on here, so they're training together as well. It's a combination of preparing them for combat and testing them as individuals to see whether they were good enough for the job.
And the first test was fitness. Even today, Achnacarry's gruelling forced marches remain part of commando folklore.
Left, right, left, right, left.
What's it like being back here now? Bring back all the memories?
Yep, the first time back, this is the first time I've seen this place since May 1943. So it's a long time.
The wartime commando course lasted between 4 and 6 weeks.
Commando Basic Training Centre, forced marches, number of 40-minute periods, 19.
Today's Royal Marine Basic Training course lasts 32 weeks, held at Lympstone in Devon. 70 years on, the objectives haven't changed.
The aim of commando training is to produce somebody who's strong and tough and fit and resourceful. Resourceful because when things don't go as planned, and they never do, you've got to have people who can make up their own minds as to what's best to do. I'm delighted with filming in this weather. This is very much what we do, is doing your job under these conditions. And the sort of training they did here is exactly the sort of training which Royal Marines Commandos do today at Lympstone.
Got a 9-mile speed march endurance course.
Well, we used to do these speed marches and the assault courses, and my uniform was never dry.
You think this is going to hurt, this is going to be painful, I can't do this. But the test, or whatever it is explained to you, and you do it, and it gives you confidence. And Commando, having done the training they do today, and the training that took place at Achnacarry, gives you confidence that you can overcome obstacles in your path, whatever they may be. 1,
2, 3, 4, 1. There's quite a big dropout rate in all this. About 30% and sometimes 50% of every squad never got through. I can remember I was absolutely determined I would do the course, even if I was dead at the end of it. But lots didn't. They said, no, sorry, Sarge, I can't do any more. I can't live this life anymore. And they were just sent back.
Shoot! Halt! To be honest, that's the kit we've got these days gives us a significant advantage, I think. I mean, I can't imagine what the likes of Norman had to sort of do that march in. But to be honest, that's the sort of basic minimum sort of standard I expect from my Marines.
I've remembered the aspects all my life, although it's a long, long time ago, and other things I've forgotten and gone forever, but this bit I'll always remember.
Fitness was the foundation of the commando course. But fitness alone didn't win battles. The recruits were taught to survive and strike out from the harshest conditions. A skill the army called
Fieldcraft. Number of 40-minute periods, 40.
The fieldcraft are basically the teaching of troops to go over all types of ground in action, tactical movement by day and by night. And it really meant just being able to appreciate the folds in the ground where there's cover here and there. And I up here had two wonderful assistants. One was a chap called Davison, who was out to Lovat Scouts, and by profession he was a ghillie. All I needed to say to the troops, I used to say, watch Davison, and he'd move as though he was stalking a prey, and he'd see a quarry like a deer or an enemy, and he'd move to the ground almost like a cat, and his rifle would come up to the shoulder, all in one movement. And I said, that's what you've got to aim for.
Achnacarry still bears the scars of those wartime fieldcraft lessons, souvenirs of the famous Tarzan course. The beech trees that supported the commandos had been planted in the summer of 1745, just as Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived in the Highlands and prepared for battle against the British Army. 2 centuries later, this highland terrain had become the perfect classroom. Now the commandos were fit and ready for any environment. The next stage was weapons training.
We don't only just look at them, but actually handle and fire them.
If you couldn't see where the enemy was when they'd open fire, you could, by training, determine where they were by sound. And we used to do a demonstration called crack and thump. And I used to put chaps out just over here at the back here, with armed with a rifle and ammunition, and they'd be concealed. And I used to challenge the trainees, say, can you see anybody? And they couldn't. And they'd blow the whistle and they'd fire a couple of rounds over their head. And of course, when the bullet goes over your head, there's a crack. And then it's followed by the thump of the actual explosion. So you hear the crack. And I say, no, that's all right. If you hear the crack, the bullet's missed you. It's gone. But look for the thump, and you just hear it. And that was a technique.
This one Highland estate was mass-producing thousands of highly trained men. But it was also producing a potent propaganda message.
The commandos had a public persona, and actually Achnacarry and the sort of legend of Achnacarry grew up very quickly because it served that purpose. Publicity was always part of the commando concept. We were talking about the special training at Inverisle. That was secret. No one knew about that. That didn't come out until after the war. There was nothing secret about Achnacarry. There was nothing secret about the commandos.
Stand by, beach defensive.
The gentlemen of the press were given ringside seats to the great Achnacarry set piece, the opposed landing.
Rapid. Fire.
Live bullets flew overhead. No records were kept of the number of men killed or injured during training.
Commando Basic Training Centre. Safety precautions. It must be remembered that we are training for war, and that if any degree of realism is to be reached, the chances of accidents occurring cannot be completely eliminated.
As a performance, the opposed landing impressed the most cynical spectators.
A fine series of exercises and demonstrations by the passing out squad of police recruits. Bullets whistling everywhere. They had killed a man 2 days earlier.
The landings took place by day and night.
This is a night opposed landing, which was the showpiece of many of the courses.
No sissy stuff, but real bullets, real bombs and real explosions. Lateral training with the lid off.
The bullets are going over the head, but they get the sensation of being fired at. They get that familiar crack
of the bullets passing by.
It was a performance fit to top any bill. A spellbinding affair in widescreen and glorious Technicolor. A dazzling cross between the Blackpool Illuminations and Guy Fawkes Night.
Wading ashore, get off those boats as quick as you can and clear the beach as quickly as possible. It's one thing we learnt right from the beginning in 1914. When you land on the beach, get off it as quickly as possible. Don't try and go to ground to cover. You'll be a sitting target if you do. You will take the chance and go like hell.
After weeks of intense training, the recruits were fighting fit. The Commando reputation was at a peak. Their audacious raid on Saint-Nazaire in March 1942 had destroyed docks vital to Germany's lethal battleships. The Commandos were glamorous, exciting, and under new management. The well-connected Lord Louis Mountbatten had taken charge. In the early summer of 1942, he was preparing Britain's most ambitious raid yet. How would the men of Achnacarry cope when it was their turn to fight? Among the first graduates of Achnacarry were 50 former policemen, dispatched to No. 4 Commando in Troon. Their new boss was Shimmy Lovett. 2 years had passed since Lovett had established that first training base at Inver Islet House. He had risen to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. And in the summer of 1942, he and his men had been selected for an audacious mission into occupied France. A raid on Dieppe.
Dieppe was not important as a military target in its own right. What was important about the Dieppe raid was that it allowed the British at a very bleak time in the war to send a signal about their aggressive intent. And that was important in particular in placating the Americans and the Russians. Things were going very badly on the Russian front in particular, and the Russians needed pressure relieving on that front.
The new boss of the Commandos, Mountbatten, had a plan. A straightforward plan. The town was to be taken by a direct frontal assault, spearheaded by the Canadian infantry. But before they could get anywhere near Dieppe, the Canadians faced a deadly threat.
Deutsche Fernkampfartillerie an der Kanalküste.
Huge German guns to the east and west of the town. Guns that could sink a troop ship 10 miles away. Those guns were to be silenced by the Commandos. In London, Lovett was shown aerial photographs of the gun battery. He identified flaws in the plans for the raid and insisted on 2 crucial changes.
First, he was able to demand that 4 Commandos' attack would not take place during daylight, but that landing would take place while it was still dark. And second, he was able to demand that he and only he would have the final say in how the plan was actually structured.
No. 3 Commando, led by John Durnford Slater, would attack German guns to the east of the town. 4 Commando, led by Lovett, would attack the guns to the west. They would clear the way for the main force to begin its assault on Dieppe. On the evening of the 18th of August 1942, Lovett and the men of 4 Commando prepared to take the battle back to France.
We were sailing from Southampton, and I was Southampton born and bred. And as I got on the deck, I just looked over into the area of Southampton where my widowed mother was living, and I just pondered and thought. And I thought, Mum, you don't know where I am, and you don't know what I'm going to do.
This was to be the biggest raid of the war. 50 squadrons of aircraft, 250 ships, 10,000 men, among them, for the first time, graduates of Achnacarry. 4 Commandos' target was the Hesse gun battery, a kilometre inland from the cliffs at Vaste-Rival, west of Dieppe. Lovett split his force in 2. One section, led by Derek Mills-Roberts, to make a direct assault. The other, which he led, would loop around and attack from the rear. Shortly before 5 a.m, Lovett and his 250 men landed on the shingle beach of Sainte Marguerite.
The Germans had seen the landing craft approaching the beach, so they were actually putting fire down on the landing craft as they arrived. They crossed the beach at a run. Lovett had insisted that any man who went to cover on the shingle would be court-martialed for that offence. Speed was of the essence. At the top of the beach, there was wire entanglement that they had to cross in order to move inland. Some of the guys were wearing thick leather jerkins and they threw themselves down, rolled around in the wire to help crush it and create a path.
A private took a couple of quick glances, one up at the arc of enemy fire, the other across at me. Then, out of the side of his mouth, he panted, "Jesus Christ, sir, this is nearly as bad as Achnacarry."
2 kilometres to the east, the 88 men of Group 1, led by Derek Mills-Roberts, had landed under the Vaste-Rival cliffs. Lovett had banned cameras. This illicit photograph is the only known record of the landing. Jimmy Dunning was in charge of a mortar section.
We had a choice of 2 clefts in the, or gullies in the cliff to go up. The left-hand one was choked full of barbed wire, and possibly mine as well, so we said, well, that was not on, and we tackled the right-hand one, and with the aid of Bangalore torpedoes, which are 6-foot iron tubes filled with explosives, we cleared a way to get up, to scramble up the cliff. On the way along, we decided, well, it was already decided, but we'd knock at 1 or 2 doors to find out if there were Germans in the locality billeted with the people.
14-year-old Gerard Cadeau lived in a cottage just above the gorge. He had grown up playing beside the deadly German guns. That morning, he was woken by the sound of fighter planes. He and his father went out to investigate. Directly opposite, with their faces blackened, were 4 soldiers in khaki uniforms. I was surprised to see khaki. We were so used to seeing German uniforms. Just down the coast, Lovett's section had left the beach at Sainte Marguerite and started the long circular track around the battery.
Now, unfortunately, the Germans had flooded the valley of the River Sarn, so the banks were very boggy. One of the commandos said that it was like running through rice pudding. Now, obviously, that puts a great physical demand upon the soldiers, and this is where the training that they'd done at Achnacarry came in really useful. When they got about 1,000 yards inland, Lovett's men moved east across the slopes towards the battery position. It's still more than half a mile away. And as they did so, there was a real sense of urgency in their movement because they could hear that the German guns had opened fire.
The battery opened up. They could obviously see the main convoy. So Derek Mills-Roberts, who was commanding our particular party, decided to speed everything up and to get in position and open fire as soon as possible. We positioned the mortars, and I had decided that I would aim at the centre of the battery. The first shower went slightly to the left, the short rather, the second one was slightly to the right, but the third one were high bingo.
Troop Sergeant Major Jimmy Dunning with his 2-inch mortar in the tree line a few hundred metres to the north. And it's the bomb from that mortar that ignites the German cordite charges within a few metres of where I'm standing, so a huge explosion. And of course, only a few minutes later, the commandos come storming in from the south. Lovett with B and F troops, bayonets fixed, grenading the Germans as they come in, close quarters combat, scenes of almost medieval savagery.
Lovett himself described the brutality of the fighting.
Considerable numbers of Germans who'd hidden in underground tunnels were either bayoneted or shot at close range by machine gun. Lovett's next words brought me to my feet. Set them on fire, he ordered, with a gesture at the surrounding building. Burn the lot. These were not the words of a commanding officer of the British Army. They were the words of a Highland chief bent on the total destruction of the enemy.
Et puis à un bon moment, mon père il dit tiens, on va aller voir sur la falaise.
My father said, let's go and see what's happening at the cliffs. My mother didn't want us to go. She was nervous. The two of us went to the cliff and saw the boats in front of the gorge. We saw soldiers coming down the path.
Devant la gorge, hein.
The commandos began the difficult task of withdrawing back towards this beach, where Jimmy Dunning and his men had landed 2.5 hours earlier. They were under sporadic German fire, but they moved down the gully and onto the beach, and then waded through the water to the landing craft waiting offshore, up to their shoulders. And once, of course, they were on the landing craft, they could set off back to the UK, satisfied that they had carried out with great success the mission that they had been assigned to complete.
The big guns would never fire again. The way was clear for the main assault on Dieppe by the Canadian infantry. Their first task was to capture the cliffs surrounding the town centre. Despite heroic efforts, they failed.
The Canadians who landed here on the morning of the 19th were slaughtered. They landed on the shingle against German opposition that was fully intact. No preliminary bombardment by air or sea. The Germans were not surprised. They were in control of their firepower in place on the headlands and in the town. The Canadians fought with extreme bravery. They tried to get into the town. Maybe 100 men out of 2,000 who came ashore succeeded in doing so. Most of the rest spent their last few hours pinned down on this beach. Hundreds of them were killed, and almost all of the remainder were rounded up and captured.
We had no idea of the tragedy, really, because the newspapers that came out next day just talked about a successful commando raid and didn't give the full details of the Canadian and naval losses.
The raid on Dieppe achieved little except casualties. From the Navy, from the Air Force, from the commandos. Over 900 Canadian soldiers lost their lives. And yet, to his death, Mountbatten remained convinced that despite the human cost, it had been a worthwhile rehearsal for D-Day.
The Duke of Wellington said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. I say that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. For every one man who was killed in Dieppe, at least 10 or more had their lives spared on the beaches of Normandy.
If you need to put 2,000 men ashore against a prepared German defence with wire, machine guns, artillery pieces and so forth, in order to learn that a frontal assault is likely to be a suicidal disaster in those circumstances, then you need your head examined. But regardless of the rights and wrongs of the Dieppe raid, of one thing we can be absolutely certain. The four commandos' role demonstrated that effective training, especially mission-specific training, was likely to create success. And certainly the commandos could go away from this operation with their head held high about a job Well done.
Back in the Highlands, the Achnacarry machine continued, relentless, but with one notable addition. In the months after Dieppe, the commandos were given a new and distinct symbol of identity. Beginning in the late summer of 1942, Charlie Vaughan presented every graduate with a green beret. This was the birth of a military legend. But just as the commandos gained their identity, they were losing their original role.
By 1943, the time for small raids in Europe was over, and we were working up for D-Day, which of course was in June 1944. And the Royal Marines and Army commandos were preparing for that in every way possible.
For the remaining months of the European conflict, the British commandos successfully waged an unfamiliar war.
The idea was that they would be used as the assault troops to break the crust of the enemy defences. They weren't actually used for commando raiding from the sea for the rest of the war in Europe.
The Germans defeated, Britain erupted in the joy of victory. For the army commandos, this would be their final victory. On the 25th of October 1945, Brigadier Bob Laycock broke the news to the men of 1st Commando Brigade.
It is a feeling of very deep regret that it has fallen to my lot to tell you today that you are to be disbanded.
The Green Beret would live on, but as the sole responsibility of the Royal Marines. Achnacarry was returned to Cameron of Lochiel, a little the worse for wear.
The house was a bit of a mess. There'd been a fire inside. My grandfather said that the last time the English had come to Achnacarry in force, they'd burnt the old house down. So the second time that they'd allowed them back, they'd done exactly the same again, all those years afterwards.
The Commando Training Depot, Achnacarry, closed its gates for the last time on the 31st of March, 1946. A remarkable 25,000 men had come here and passed the Commando Basic Training course. Today, on a hill between the camp and the railway station at Spean Bridge, those early commandos are immortalised in bronze. Scott Sutherland's 3 soldiers have their eyes forever fixed towards the wild Highland hills.
No one forgets going to Achnacarry, and that lovely statue of the men looking beyond has a symbolism, and one does feel proud because it conjures up a lot of memories. Conjures up some very fine men